We should be able to speak to our correspondent, Catherine Trent Norris, who's in central Paris this morning. Catherine, what effect are you seeing of the strike so far?
Good morning, Gavin. Well, you can see behind me one of the very visible effects of this strike movement. There are still large piles of rubbish, of garbage, uncollected bins littering the streets of Paris. It's estimated that as of this morning, there are some 7,000 tons of uncollected rubbish still lying around the French capital. And I can tell you the smell is pretty strong. Now, the French government had ordered some bin collectors to get back to work and collect the rubbish for health reasons, because there are worries about, disease spreading from all this refuse uncollected on the streets. But the situation's more complicated than that. They are getting to work in some areas, but in fact the incinerator sites or the waste transformation sites are actually blocked by protesters and trade unions in some areas. So it's going to take another couple of weeks, authorities here in Paris say, to get the streets clear of rubbish. Aside from that, I'm also outside one of usually the busiest train stations in central Paris, and it is extremely quiet this morning. Traffic is very much disrupted. So we're talking trains throughout France, metro services here in Paris, regional trains, and if you look across the border, other transport services, flights are also heavily disrupted. So 30% of flights cancelled coming in and out of France's Orly airport. So check if you're going to be travelling around there. Also, many schools are still shut with lots of teachers out on strike again today.
You can hardly miss it, can you? The image behind you. I mean, if you look at any social media site, usually the hashtag springtime in Paris, you can tend to see it's juxtaposed with images of rubbish piled high. Now, looking at it today, how do you sense it compares to previous days of strikes? Is it a sign of loosening off after Macron's interview yesterday?
Well, I can tell you that the feeling of public anger has by no means gone away. People reacting to Emmanuel Macron's TV interview were basically, a lot of them who were already upset about these pension reforms were further riled by his remarks, basically insisting that he's right, but he hasn't explained these reforms well enough to the French people. Well, trade union leaders have, can I put it politely, said that is mocking or making a mockery of the French public, and they've told people to come out again in force and demonstrate on the streets later. So the strike action, this is the 9th nationwide strike day, but we've got to look as well at the protests which are planned for later this Thursday in Paris and throughout France to see how many people come out on the streets and how violent they've got. Because you get these big planned protest marches, but also these kind of wildcat or unplanned protests springing up at different sites, and they are being cracked down on pretty hard by the French riot police, who've been out in force with tear gas, arresting protesters. So, things have been coming pretty violent, pretty tense, and we're watching out to see what will happen on that front later on today.
And you mentioned refineries, and I know the situation is not clear across the whole of France. It's very different, but it's not that easy in some places to get petrol, is it?
That's right. It's estimated around 15% of French petrol stations at the moment having some kind of difficulty. So either running out of fuel or having difficulties getting supplies. And that is because workers at oil refineries in France have started blockades, particularly down in the south of France, around the Marseille region, and in the northwest in Brittany. So that's something that French commuters, already being hit hard, of course, by these transport strikes, are keeping an eye on. And they have got some of the hardest line trade unions, again, wildcat movements there, which could, really harden in the days and weeks to come. We'll have to wait and see whether this protest movement carries on and whether this anger continues to rise, or now that this law is basically certain to become law, it just needs to be signed off by President Macron and the Constitutional Court. Well, whether the fact that it is now been passed through Parliament, albeit by force, by this use of this constitutional 49.3 amendment, whether it will now die off or whether the anger will harden.
Catherine Norris Trent, our correspondent in the centre of Paris, thanks for joining us.